Hi, everybody. My name is Steve Cadigan, and I'd like to welcome you to this webinar that we are hosting today by Filtered. And we're going to wait just a minute or two to allow some late arrivals to come in. So just give us a minute and we'll get started.
We could try humming a four-part muzak for them, a cappella muzak, while they wait.
Uh-oh, we just lost 5 attendees. No, just kidding. Yeah, the way that Zoom works, you have to open the gates and then people will slowly join.
I see.
There we go. Okay, well, why don't we go ahead and get started? Once again, for those of you that just joined, my name is Steve Cadigan. I'm going to be the moderator for today's panel on diversity in technology recruiting and emerging technology recruiting. We have just an amazing panel lined up for you today. Before we get started, I must admit to all of you that I don't like panels. So I'm not sure how I got recruited to this. So what the sponsors, Filtered, did was say, Steve, this is going to be an unwebinar. So that's sort of our permission to, we're going to try to deliver this a little bit differently, try to have more of a conversation than have it be programmed. And we have not scripted anything here other than the framework that we want to work within, which is to try to address this whole notion of, you know, what is a good diversity recruiting strategy look like? How can companies become better? What are some of the reasons why we may be struggling with this in technology in particular? And is AI a solution that we can leverage? And as I said, we've got an incredible panel here. And what I'd like to do to get started is ask them to introduce themselves and share a story with us around, from their life experiences around something that they've experienced that shaped their view of diversity. I'll go first. I was born in America, but grew up in South Africa for the first 6 years of my life. And my father was a minister and a bit of a radical, both my parents were. And we ultimately were kicked out of South Africa when I was about 7 years old. And there were protests in the airport in Durban when my father was asked to leave the country. And so right around the time my memory was forming, around age 6 or 7, I grew up in a reality where, you know, race and difference of race was a big part of the conversation in my family. So this has been a meaningful area for me, just personally and professionally, particularly around racial diversity in my life. And another side note, my dad actually drove Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to the airport the night he won the Nobel Peace Prize, which is a story that I've written a whole blog about if you want to hear it, which is kind of cool. But so let's welcome the panelists, Vivian, Kian, and Paul. Who wants to get us started with a little story around who you are and your story around diversity?
Step up, gentlemen.
So I'm Paul Bilodeau, and the founder CEO of Filtered. So I grew up in a small suburban town in Massachusetts with exactly one Black family, one Jewish family, and one Asian family. Now, because you fell in love with basketball at an early age and was in a tournament and played really well against an inner city team, I was recruited at 13 years old to start playing basketball in the inner city, where obviously I was the only white guy. So I spent around 14 years being on the other side, being the minority, and also understanding that my opportunities after basketball were far different, and seeing how folks were growing up, and, give me really appreciation, for all the effort and that it takes to actually to make it. One of my best friends, we all grew up, most of us made Division I basketball. A couple played after, some made the NBA, some won national championships. But one of my best friends who ended up playing for Celtics, winning 2 national championships with the University of Kentucky. I mean, he shared a bedroom with 7 of his cousins. So I grew up hyper aware of the advantages that I had, growing up, and even in prep school in Maine, where the coach said, "Look, you're going to be fine after basketball. Most of these guys are going to end up back where they came from." So it had a major impact on my life, just having different opportunities.
Great, thanks, Paul. Kian, you want to take us forward?
Yeah, I'm Kian. I'm founder and CEO at Workera. I'm a founding member at Filtered.ai, and I teach the Stanford Deep Learning class. And a story around diversity, I'd say maybe one of the most striking memories that I have around diversity is that I come from the suburb of Paris, where you'll find a mix of all religions, ethnicity, genders, and my high school actually was a very good mix of people. So I would consider that diverse. But when I joined university, the first thing that struck me is taking the metro to that university for the first day of class. You would find that you have a good mix of people. You have a lot of people of color in the metro. You have a lot of boys and girls, males and females. And when I looked around myself in the university, I found that you can barely see 1 or 2 Black person, 1 or 2 immigrant-born individuals, and only about 20% women. And there is the first time I would say that I really felt that this problem of diversity is at a larger scale than I thought. Yeah.
Thanks, Kian.
Great. Well, I'll jump in, and then we can get to some actual questions. So I'm Vivian Ming, and I've had the chance to share a lot of stories before about myself. You can't go through gender transition and not see the world differently. And it's something maybe in a sense that was just picked down, which is this someone who's experienced a change, where you become a different person because you're in a different place or culture treats you differently. It expands your vision of the world. I was at Stanford when I lost my position there, and the person responsible said, "I didn't know I was paying for your baby and your transition," told me I'd lost my edge, and let me go. In the years since, I've founded 4 companies. I've been the chief scientist at a couple of more. Steve and I know each other from a guild where I was the chief scientist. I don't know that I lost my edge, but he saw me as a completely different person. A weird kind of a compliment, right? Of you want to be a woman? Well, guess what? But since we had a lot of stories from our childhood, an interesting story that kind of goes in the other direction is about representation. I grew up in the Bay Area. And if anyone is a Bay Area and you're too old like me, then you grew up watching Channel 2, cartoons, all these terrible syndicated. I must have mainlined 5,000 hours of Scooby-Doo. And one of the things that ran, a little PSA, like every 15 minutes that ran when I was a kid in the 70s in San Francisco were these things. They'd be these long vignettes of Chinese American life in San Francisco, or Mexican American life in San Francisco, or African American life. And then it would end with, all these kids shouting, "I'm proud to be a Chinese American. I'm proud to be African American." And just like, it almost left me like, gosh, I want to be something too. But that kind of representation, even at a time in the 70s in San Francisco, where the truth was the Bay Area and the city was a nightmare, that kind of representation of what it could be boy, did it get in my head. That was the way the world should be. And I've never been able to set it aside. And, you know, now I research it and I build companies around it, and it just infuses who you are. Though it also leaves you understand some of the cultural diversions in the United States. If you didn't really get indoctrinated that way when you were young, maybe this explains why some people are shocked by recent videos and other people are saying, so what's changed? We know the world's terrible for a great many people. But that representation is powerful, and it certainly influenced me.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think that takes us to a place where it's a great starting point for us. And that is, you know, what the heck is diversity? I mean, I've been in the recruiting world for over 30 years. So it's my first job out of college. And I've worked in 6 or 7 different industries. And I've also played around a lot in this whole notion of culture. And I think everyone has a different definition of, I don't know that there's a right one for diversity or a wrong one necessarily, but maybe we should just pause, because in the narrative in the United States right now, you know, in light of the murder of George Floyd, is around racial difference. And prior to that, particularly in Silicon Valley, and 3 of us on this call are sort of mostly spending time in Silicon Valley, it's gender difference and gender equality. How would you guys help our audience frame diversity from we're building an organization? How should we think about that? In light of the context that we're in right now, you know, diversity's gone from red hot to white hot to, I don't know, what's the next level up from white hot in terms of people wanting to approach it. But first of all, you can't solve a problem you don't know how to define necessarily. And so maybe the first place is, you know, how do you guys think about diversity, or how would you encourage our audience to think about it?
I'm going to talk too much if people allow me to. So let me get started. Kerry Washington, the actress, was just interviewed, and she said some things that really resonated with me. But one thing she said, I will dispute simply as a wonky scientist. She says, right now, diversity is still being defined in terms of a difference from being a white man. That it's not, that we are somehow have to be different. And so as a scientist, and someone that also uses, machine learning and explicit computational modeling to understand a lot of questions in social science, diversity actually has a pretty good scientific definition. It gets used in ecological diversity to understand biology. It gets used in brains to understand interesting heterogeneities in neurophysiology. So this idea is just, let's keep it simple. I believe right now, the city of Oakland is about 25% white, 25% black, 25% Latina, and 25% Asian. Obviously, there are a lot of other people, and what the hell is Asian supposed to mean? But we have a broad ethnic grouping there. And, a city like that has a lot of diversity in that it has a very even mix of these broad different groups. It isn't that they are in some way defined as being different than white, just that it is made up of many. We could also criticize it though, because it turns out these diverse groups don't tend to interact that much, particularly white and black tend to just live in their own worlds, even within the city. But I'm just gonna start out with, we can present some formal definitions. Since we're going to talk about AI, you might imagine some cost functions we might actually try to optimize for. But there are some well-formalized ways we could think about this in a computational sense, which is not very exciting when we're talking about human beings. But I'm just, to start off, there is a way we can talk about it.
Kian and Paul, I mean, both of you guys are, you run companies in the recruiting space. You're working with companies that are trying to hire these endangered species called, software developers. Have you run across organizations that have pretty clear definitions of this? Do you think it's an area that's still under development? People are still trying to figure it out? Like what react to, what Vivian just said?
I mean, I guess like unfortunately, most companies treat diversity as not a North Star, but they treat it as a tactic. And they form a task group, mainly of people from, let's say you put a bunch of white people on a task group, then what do you think is going to happen? And it's to check a box for the most part, and it's too hard. If you can't just do a search on a resume for like HBCUs or affinity groups, then it's too hard. And so let's have diversity, not in engineering. Let's have diversity in housekeeping, security. I'm in a WeWork building, and I can tell you where the diversity is. It's not in the staff that we interact with. It's in the cleaning staff. And that's unfortunate. And I think, you have a lot of bias in the process, right? You have bias interview process. We've seen and heard of and captured different interview questions for different folks for the same role, just to knock people out. No, I don't think there's a lot that they're getting right.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Kian? What are you seeing?
I'd say that although Workera and Deeplearning.ai, which are the companies I started, are more on the consumer education side of things, it's closely related to recruiting. And what the way I like to think about it is there is two important problems, which is democratizing access to education, which online learning platforms like Coursera, like Udemy, Udacity, edX have done a great job at today. If you're looking, 30 years ago, if you were to find computer science specialists, or 50 years ago, you would look at only a few hubs in the world, just because there was no good way to learn computer science. Today, thanks to this platform, you find AI practitioners, computer science practitioners in everywhere in the world. And so the world has changed, and access to education has been democratized. So I'm very excited about that. However, when I look at the workplace, I don't find the same diversity. And so I think that the problem that I like to focus on with my team is this access to work problem. How do we bind this access to education to convert it in democratizing access to work? So that's how.
So let me, I started with my very wonkified definition, and there's a reason I actually started there, which is, you look at biomes that are more diverse, there are more species, more genetic diversity. Turns out they're more robust, they last longer, they're healthier, they produce more nutrients. It's just better. So does the metaphor hold? And it's really clear, when you look at the economic performance of public companies, which are the easiest to track, almost any way you slice it, more diverse companies perform better. But to me, there are still definitions we could use. I agree. D&I is overwhelmingly treated as corporate responsibility, not a core business issue, not do we have the right talent. And in that sense, there is a particular facet of diversity, which I have found is simply can't be ignored, and yet it is the least well appreciated, which is representation. Not just are we making an effort in hiring from universities, not just are people feeling included, but literally, who is your leadership team? Who is on your board? Let's put it simply. If your board all looks exactly the same, it's the single biggest thing you will ever say to anyone who might ever be an employee of yours or a customer of yours. You have to be like this to be successful. And in fact, we've been able to run analyses showing exactly that one of the single biggest predictors of wage gap for women, I'm absolutely guarantee it would be true whether we look at race or disability or anything else. The lack of representation is a huge driver of these things. So it may feel like some people may misinterpret this as some form of tokenism or quotas, but diversifying your leadership team, actual representation of people that have lived different lives, not just that they look a little bit different, but they also went to Harvard. People that have lived different lives is transformative for companies. But that is, I think, the least pursued avenue of diversity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fascinating. I want to encourage the audience to participate in this, and we welcome your questions. If you want to go to the Q&A screen, if you want to go to the chat box and make a comment. I want to pose a question to the audience, and then we'll move on to the flow of the conversation here. Are you sitting in an organization that has in your view, has a clear, well-articulated diversity strategy? I'm just curious if you are, yes or no, if you would. And if it's a yes, if you wouldn't mind sharing who that company is, we'd love to hear that. But let's follow up on this problem of diversity. We're not here to debate if there's a problem of diversity. There is a problem of diversity. But I want to hear from you guys, where do you think that problem sits? Do we have a supply problem? This is the number one response I hear when I'm with hiring managers is like, well, there's not a big enough pool of applicants. That's why, I'm not able to diversify. Is it a bias problem? Is it a lack of it being a priority problem? Is it all of these problems? Like, how do you guys see diversity as a problem? Like, where are the roots of this? And there may be many, right? What do you think, Paul? Do you have a theory?
I think it's all the above. I think there's a supply issue when it's pretty clear that technical skills are the future or the path to the middle class. But yet you don't have laptops or computers in schools. So how are you going to be competent enough to enter an engineering program? So there's bias, obviously, that we all know that. So yeah, I think it's multifaceted. I think I'm hopeful this time around. It's not just a check the box. I mean, if you can look back, year over year since this last economic cycle, diversity has been a thing, and especially in tech since 2012. With lack of diversity, nothing's changed. It's 2020, right? So, and I think I'm hoping that this is kind of the lightning strike moment where people actually, take this very seriously and not just, I went to, Alpha's national convention and I paid $100,000 for a booth so I can check this box. So at the end of the year, when the EEOC does an audit, right? So yeah, I think it's a bigger problem. It's not just one-sided.
Yeah, Kian?
Yeah, I agree. I also think the problem sits at all levels. And one thing I do usually with my students, or even looking back at my own life and asking myself, how the hell did I end up 5,000 miles away from home? And I know many of you also are thousands of miles away from home. So what happens? And when I think about it, I see milestones, which can be, publishing an article, succeeding in a sport event, meeting someone. That was key. That was a key milestone. And then I think that why did I achieve those milestones, or why did you achieve those milestones? What pushed you to that? And I realized that there are two things. One is the environment in which you were, maybe fostered your or influenced you, and secondly, the mentorship that you had access to. So to me, the diversity problem sits at all levels and is related to the variations of environments and access to mentorship that people had through their life. So if we want everyone, regardless of their background, their ethnicity, their gender, to access opportunity and achieve their fullest potential, we have to provide equal access to the right environment and mentorship. And this is complicated, but that's my thinking.
I hear about pipeline all the time. I've heard about the pipeline problem for 20 years, as long as I've been paying attention to any of this. And it's not a pipeline problem. It's a laziness problem. It's not an issue for the people that actually are making the decisions. And there's a number of ways that we could look at what's going on there. Everything that's been said is true. One of the big economic awards last year went to a woman who studies how things like Spanish colonial policy from hundreds of years ago today still affects the lives of people that live in neighboring towns. You know, less money, their kids are smaller because of policies from hundreds of years ago. So we got a lot of historic baggage that isn't going to magically go away. But I think whenever I hear pipeline, what I really hear is the first person that walked through the door wasn't a Black candidate, so it's not our fault. You know, we didn't do the work to go find the right person, and we shouldn't have to. Here's an example. I'm not going to call out this group, but I was on the advisory board for a large financial institution for a while, and they very nicely impaneled a group of their top fund managers to answer questions for this advisory board. One of the board members was Byron Allen. So if you're as old as I am, you remember he was a talk show host sort of in the 80s, Black guy. But oh my goodness, as you might imagine from a talk show host, smooth operator. So he, with this giant smile on his face, he looks at these 5 straight white guys and says, so tell me, why is it that there isn't a single woman, Black, female Black, or openly LGBT fund manager here at the bank? And of course they hummed and hawed, and they said, you know, what I hear over and over again, which is, we would love to have people like that, but we hire the best, and these are the best people we can find. And you could imagine that didn't go over well. It certainly didn't with me. I said, the one thing I can guarantee you about that statement is that it's not true. And the only degree that it might be true is with respect to the questions you've been asking. And I bet you didn't even realize you were asking a question. So we took them through a little exercise, and sure enough, they had essentially one big filtering question. Do you currently manage $1 billion fund? Well, guess what? Way back then, there were no women, no openly LGBT, and one single Black man who built the fund himself. So immediately, their diverse talent pool that they could hire from was one person in the entire world. Everyone else was not even under consideration. All right, well, I'm hardcore enough about data that if you can prove to me that that question is diagnostic, maybe we should let it fly. But of course, it never occurred to them whether that question actually predicted success on the job. In fact, a lot of research shows that just as with entrepreneurs, women often take less money and return more. And we see a lot of phenomena like this. So, you know, just seeing it again and again, it's not my fault. I would love to hire someone. My heart's in the right place. I'm not the enemy in this story. Are you actually making a difference? Are you actively going out and finding the person that's going to challenge you, that is not going to fit your default model of who this candidate should be? Because if you're not doing that, then yeah, you're right. There isn't a carbon copy of you except, you know, 10 skin shades darker that you're going to find.
All right, so we have a comment and a question that came in. The comment was, hey, Steve, can you ask the panelists to sort of take another shot at, you know, defining what a good diverse recruiting agenda or a good diversity agenda looks like, because their answers were a little unsatisfying. And so, you know, I know I've struggled with this my whole career in terms of what company is doing this really well, and to try to say there's a model. And I, as a recovering human resource professional, I found in every organization that I've worked in, people know more what they don't want from human resources than what they do want, because they probably haven't seen it operating or humming along. And it's a weird function because you're control and you're also nurturing. But do you guys have you know, a working model that you've seen or that you're working towards to help our audience sort of shape like something to aim towards that maybe it's not perfect, but maybe it's better than, you know, darts on a dartboard trying to do this?
Partnering with organizations in an authentic way, not just going in and giving them money for their conference. You have to go where people are, right? You know, you're not going to just wake up one day and you know, post a job and magically get diversity. But I think if you're people can tell the difference between what's authentic and what isn't authentic, and, we start with, partnering with various groups around and really just trying to help, but then try to promote candidates out of those groups. Like, we've given software and tools to those folks to help their members around mentoring and mock interviewing and things of that nature, but we also are hopeful to hire from those organizations. That's our internal hack. But it just doesn't start, a lot of folks think you just post a job and it happens. And also don't do the diversity. Like, we see it in our performance, right? Just people know when they're diversity hire. And another story going back to college when, in basketball practice, one guy on the team got hired, who's 6'11" from Fidelity Investments. And one of my teammates, who's also Black, has said, you're the diversity hire. Like, that's a thing, like, they know, right? And so we see it with performance where, okay, why are you interviewing this group with over 10 years of experience, but this group isn't 2 years of experience? So, because you're trying to fill that job with that person. That means you're not trying hard enough, right? You're just lowering the bar over here, and that when that person goes to work, they know right away, because the people on the team are going to treat them like the diversity hire, right? And it's so I think we're just not thinking, we're not treating it as a real business problem. There's smart companies, there's smart people in these companies that are just they're half-assing it, right? And it's not being taken seriously.
There's a comment that came in here, which I think fits what you're saying, from one of the participants, which was, the solution to this is probably multi-pronged approach along the lines of what you were also saying, Vivian, which is your recruitment team diversified? Is the board diversified? Candidates are not going to apply or stay if they don't see themselves and who they interact with during the interview process. And people believe what they see. And I think we got to find a way to move from talking about this or being politically correct about it or doing this out of guilt towards doing it out of, the higher purpose of more profits and greater, benefit to society. Let's see.
Well, to come back to the representation question, and maybe, I don't think that there is a definition. One thing for me is don't hire individual positions, hire teams. Make certain, what is diversity as a person is not really a thing. It's that the team is diverse. When you're thinking about how do I put together a high performance team where everyone is bringing something different, but also they're bringing something complementary. There are touch points between people at the same time, that there are experiential differences and gender and ethnic differences, differences that really add value. That's what we're truly looking for here. I think there's a couple of things that you shouldn't and things you should. One is, and I know this gives HR people heart attacks when I say it, but don't give bonuses for hiring friends. What do you think your employees' friends are going to look? They're going to look just like your employees. So, you reinforce whatever your current company's makeup is. You tend to even make it worse. But that is such a go-to strategy, but it is all short-term, no long-term. But another, flipping it around, I actually worked with this one big pharma company, and they had a problem, which was more women were graduating in research chemistry than men. But they ran this really intensive hiring program for a couple of years. It had been modestly successful, and then the person who ran it left, and everything fell apart. And they were still heavily male on their research chemistry team. And, I said, listen, you need to make a change here. Right now, you essentially have something kind of like a token. There's like one woman at every lab. Put them together in a central office. I'm really talking about how do we fix a real problem in real time inside a company, not an ideal. Put them together in a central lab, make certain everyone has to interact with that lab so that the dumb parts of the human brain don't simply think, well, most of the research chemists I see are men, so that men must be research chemists. Instead, they see an actual diversity of people doing that job. And what's interesting is we're talking about an entirely internal process. And yet, after doing that, their hiring rates for women went up sharply in the next recruiting year, simply because the tone and the culture of the company had changed, because we'd essentially hacked people's heads, got it out of their head that this particular job was only done by men. We didn't even actually change the numbers, because the numbers are all a fixed process in that particular job vertical. So we just changed the way people interacted with the idea that it would change the future. And it did. Again, representation is a huge driver of this thing, a positive driver. I'm gonna drop one more thing here. It's actually a really cool paper. It just came out earlier this year from a group at Stanford. They did an analysis of science publications and found that people from traditionally underrepresented backgrounds in science on a number of different metrics produced more innovative, high impact research, and yet were cited less and dropped out at every stage along the tenure process. So they did the good work they were supposed to and still didn't get recognized for it. Why would you stick it out? There are so many other ways you could spend your energy than trying to reform an institution that doesn't want to be reformed. So instead of putting it on the groups to do it, you need to make some ownership, because I don't know, the way I think of it sometimes is somebody's gonna figure it out, and they're your competitor and they're gonna eat your lunch. I mean, if that is the only thing that gets through to you, the only issue you care about, it is a true statement. And you don't want to be a dinosaur that's still running PR campaigns that don't tell the truth.
And that gets us into the discussion on meritocracy. I'll be the first one to tell you that most hiring managers, and even as high as the CEO, when I'm recruiting, it's like I'm being measured by the speed and the quality, quote unquote, quality of hire. And rarely have I seen diversity as a measurement in the quality of the hire. And rarely have I seen teams, the focus, as you said, Vivian, on a team recruiting strategy versus fill a role or a certain position. But, and if you talk to recruiters are not usually going to get smacked for hiring a white Stanford grad versus a diversity Penn State grad. They're actually, it's much more risky for them to promote someone like that. So, but what are your thoughts on, meritocracy, particularly in technical talent? Paul, maybe I'll direct this at you. Why do you think people still are defaulting to pedigree versus, real aptitude?
Well, there's a book on the shelf here, The Meritocracy Trap.
Mm-hmm.
So meritocracy has good intent, but the impact can be negative. But I think why they default, I mean, it's simple. You just said it earlier. If you present someone from XYZ background that also, and actually we have a pretty good story around it in the system. There was a candidate that scored in the bottom 20%, but went to IIT, did a PhD from University of Michigan, worked at Facebook, Amazon, and Google, and yet scored in the bottom percentile. How many companies would have shortlisted? How many companies would have hired that person because of the background? I mean, that blew me away. And then I showed it to everybody in the company around the, look at the performance, but that person is going to get hired somewhere, just because that's going to stick out. And the recruiter thinks that, oh yeah, we can skip multiple steps for you. You worked at these companies, you did these schools, that's great. Yeah, I think it comes down to friction. I think there's friction we see a lot of friction between talent acquisition teams and highly technical teams. Stop sending me bad people. And so that's the proxy that you have is backgrounds.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Kian, let's move to the shifting, because we got about 20 minutes left here, and AI, we haven't really opened that present under the tree just yet, but is AI going to help us solve this? Do you think that you're in the world of deep learning and AI, you're seeing a lot of what the future what this technology can do? Is this something we should look at with hope or fear or both? What do you think?
I think technology can help us solve this meritocracy, diversity problem, but AI will also play a part in it. It's not going to be only AI. And something that my team is working on and that we're very excited about is providing the tools, standardized tools that people can use to evaluate themselves. Because as Paul said, today, a hiring manager would have a pile of 100 resumes, and they would spend on average, say, 8 seconds on every resume. And in 8 seconds, you know what you can see. You can see if the person graduated from MIT, you will see it. If the person worked at Google, you will see it. But that's 1% or less than 1% of the pile. And so you're going to reject a huge amount of people based on information or signals that are not correct. So I think technology can help provide richer signals to hiring managers, to recruiters that are going to help this meritocracy happen. However, there are some downsides. I think one thing that I'm excited about, but I haven't seen being figured out, it's what I would call the Holy Grail label in the HR tech space / ed tech space, which is performance. Today, you don't see any company that has a label on performance that can be backtracked and say, hey, this was a good hire. People have it in their mind, meaning if you're senior, you have hired 100 people in your life, you have seen some patterns. It is encoded in some people's minds, sometimes in a biased way, but machines have not been able to label that at a granular level that can be backtracked and used in a selection process.
Ken, at Guild, I think one of the more notorious things we discovered in our analysis, I've even written about this story several times, was this guy named Jose Zamora. He says no one's responding to any of his resumes, so he drops the S out of his name. And his claim in this blog post that goes viral is Joe's getting all of these job offers that Jose isn't, which is a story that's been researched a lot. It's not just his, but this has been a whole science around it. And so I took our data set of 122 million people. We didn't have deep neural networks really robustly running back then, but a lot of machine learning. And sure enough, the biggest predictor of whether you get a job, whether you get a promotion, is the university you went to. And then if you worked at a brand name company, that was great too. But they were pretty modest predictors of what was the quality of code that you write, what was the deal volume that the salespeople had. Instead, when you looked at what predicted that, the biggest things were things that had, turns out, are just as predictive sort of across the board, which is, are they resilient? Interesting enough, we're seeing this right now in lockdown. Baidu, the big company Baidu just released a big report. There's been a lot of initiatives. They're looking at their programmers, who's remaining productive, who isn't, what kind of projects. And there's really interesting analyses. We've actually, here at Socos, have been able to put some of these together. But it turns out, again, people, all the things that we had found were predictive of people doing good work are the most strong predictors of people remaining productive during lockdown. They're resilient, they're creative, they have good social skills. These are things we should be hiring for, not only because they're predictive, but because it turns out they don't meaningfully vary across race or gender or any other characteristic, which is something you always need to check for. Going to Harvard is even more predictive if you're Black. I think for ugly reasons, but it's true. It's like an invisible ink on your diploma is written, this Black man is safe, go ahead and hire him. It doesn't change the man, but it changed the way society treats him. Yep. If instead what we saw was, regardless, if here's the promise of AI, I'm not saying we are living it, here's the promise. If it could tell you, this man is resilient, this man is has amazing analogical reasoning skills and great communication. Like, that is what predicts success. And in its absence, we hire the Stanford grad because we're assuming that's what that diploma is saying to us. And it turns out it's kind of weakly saying it. but not very strongly. And it's not what we want. What we want is to know the actual person. If we could see the value of a human being, hiring would look completely different.
Yeah, yeah. And
are we getting closer to that, Vivian? I mean, do you feel like we're, closing in on it, you think?
Well, let me hand off back to Kian, but I can say we've done some, I think, really exciting proof of concept work here at my philanthropic lab at SOCOS. And there's some other groups like Pymetrics and other that are very invested in understanding the psychometrics of success on the job. But Kian.
No, I was going to say I completely agree. And I think that it's such a complex problem, and the measurement tools that we have today are not great. So governments have actually attempted to solve this problem at a large scale within countries, and I've seen a mixed success. At least in France, where I come from, and it's the case of many more countries. The education system is theoretically meritocratic, meaning that education is free. You don't need to pay. You can do all your education up to high school for free, even after. And second, access to the top schools is based on nationwide standardized exams. So it's interesting because in spite of the system being like that, you'll find that at the top schools, a majority of the students are born in a family where one of the members went to that same top school. And then you're thinking, what went wrong? We encoded meritocracy in our system, and this is the result that we're seeing. And it turns out that there's actually a fun fact, which is that the word education in English maps to two different words in France. One of the words is éducation, which means what you learn at home, or what you're taught at home. And the other word is enseignement, which is what you're learning at school, what you're taught at school. And so what we're realizing is, although equity in education, meaning equity in enseignement, which is equity at school, has been encoded in the system, equity at home was not encoded in the system. And so while kid A from a more wealthy family was working with their tutors at home to ensure that they're assimilating the coursework, kid B from a more modest background was helping their parents or their siblings. And so this is the realization that even if we put in place the tools that are good, we need to have a holistic approach and tackle the problem at every step of the process.
I think if you read the sort of secret definition of the word meritocracy, I mean, I love the literal definition, but if you read the secret definition, it would say the secret code that only some families teach their kids to succeed in life. It's not magic, but if you're raised, if you're a kid, your parents are wealthy Palo Alto, Los Altos Hills types, you are raised from day one to take that flag and carry it forward. You're going to go to Stanford. You are going to found a company. You're going to do all these from the moment. So all these systems that we build with the idea that they're meritocratic is something I say a lot about technology. Technology is inevitably inequality increasing because the people that need it the least are the ones that benefit the most. And it turns out our meritocratic system is just another technology which is better exploited by the people that have the most resources.
It's fascinating.
And so you asked another question, and then I should shut up. I think there is some really interesting work in artificial intelligence right now looking at some of these questions. Whether we're looking inside of companies, I'm going to try and keep this a little short, but whether we're looking inside of companies, we've had the chance to do analyses to say, this is really wonky. So if you're an AI fan, using credit assignment and value-added modeling to build a giant model to measure the value add of individual employees within an organization, as though they were like nodes in a giant deep neural network. So we're not talking about the individual KPIs that someone decided ahead of time would be the right thing to measure. We're just saying, how does this person transform the organization? And what we found inside several gigantic companies was the things that drove the most productivity were often the least recognized. It was the classic. It was the person that made everyone around them better. and then didn't get promoted because they weren't the loudest person in the room. They weren't recognized, like those young, Black scientists whose research is revolutionary but gets undercited. These people were transforming their companies, and it wasn't being recognized. And so again, I'm talking about what we sometimes call it experimental HR. Like, what's the cutting edge? Not suitable for the real workplace yet, but can we see how people truly transform a company? And again, I think the promise is there with AI. But the starting point you have to understand is, and I say this all the time, AI is just a tool. It cannot solve a problem you do not already know the solution to. One thing we know about diversity is we have not figured it out. So if you think AI is the magic solution that's just going to solve this problem for you, absolutely not. An incredibly powerful tool that a company could use to transform itself. Yeah, that I think is a real potential.
Yeah, we've got a flood of questions coming in, which is awesome, which I think calls out the reality that there's no way in 1 hour of this webinar that we can cover everything. And I didn't mention in the beginning, and I should have, that this is going to be the first of several on this topic. And I think we would love your input, if you would, in the Q&A or the chat box around the hot buttons for you. One interesting question, and I'm sorry, I don't know that we're going to be able to get to all of them in the next 10 minutes, that came up is this notion of quotas, okay? And, the question is, a lot of companies set quotas for diversity in hiring. Should it be a fixed preset quota? In light of that, is your guidance to compromise maybe a little bit on the quote skills to achieve a quota hire? And do you guys have any experience with that? Paul, do you work with any companies or see any your clients that have quotas, and any success or failures you see from that process?
Yeah, I mean, if you're dealing with the Fortune 500, they have quotas. I think, one of our customers typically where we kick off a pilot is, let's just start where your ATS rejected. Like, what candidates did they reject based on keywords? And then we'll run all of those folks through Filtered and programming exercises. And voila, you get diversity. And you get some of your first hires. And one is a Fortune 100 multinational corporation and a top brand. We changed the way they hire. They rejected a candidate because of a job title. But if you look underneath it, it's like, well, they built CI, it said ETL developer, it's a big data role. It didn't match the title. But if you looked underneath it, that they're doing the right work. Didn't have a college degree. Okay. Resume was formatted funky. And the last thing is like, okay, he's also Latino. That's their first hire. He outperformed 271 candidates on a program exercise. They used a publicly facing question. So he actually outperformed 6,000 candidates. And now this company has no reason, this isn't one of the top tech companies. So we're and now there's not a lot of, I just noticed recently that they left and went to Uber. Now, this candidate would have never had a shot of getting there. Now there obviously wasn't groups around them where they were hired to keep them there, right? You were able to hire them, but then there's not that community there to keep them there. So, yeah, we see it. We see it all the time, and it's really, why don't we stop looking at resumes in the first step of the process, and it fixes the problem. Some of it, right? It doesn't fix what happens after the hire, right? There has to be groups there. There has to be people support. Then, teams need to be broken up. And, I like the fact that, we talk about team hiring, right? Let's stop, in sports. So like a sports team's not going to draft 5 point guards, but companies hire the same person over and over and over and over again because it's less risky.
Paul, rest our consciences here and make us put us at ease. Did the company learn a lesson there and change their ways
Oh
from
yeah,
that hire?
yeah. Well, college degrees are no longer required globally for engineers. Great.
Wow. Okay.
Because you can learn it online. I think that it's more of a proxy for the person that is on deep learning or Coursera or edX learning on their own than it is, I went to college because everybody else did.
Yeah, I've rarely shared this, Steve, but one of the most interesting findings of all my time at Guild was we built a ranking of all the universities, how predictive they were of the software developers in our system. So 11 million people, thousands of universities. The bottom 2/3 were negatively predicted. In other words, you'd rather they didn't say anything about, realistically, they spent time going there because they thought they were supposed to. They took out loans and now they're paying them back and it's hurting them. Yeah, there was a genuine bump if you got a bachelor's of computer science from Stanford. But to me, the biggest story is how many people were wasting large chunks of their life trying to get a piece of paper. And I think we can recognize, what does that university degree actually represent? It's not that you're qualified to do the job, because to be honest, most university grads aren't really actually all that qualified.
Well.
They're not often ready for the job market. It's that you're culturally ready, that you fit in with the people that are there already. That's what it's really a signal for. And when I think about quotas, I think about that old saying about democracy. It's the worst form of government except all the other ones. I think quota is the worst diversity strategy possibly entertain, except if you're entertaining it, then there you go. Nothing else has worked for you. If you're talking about it, that should be your next step. Know that you failed. This is the solution to that failure. There are better ways of diversifying your company, but apparently you're not willing to take them. So if you can't, then do this. And I think even if it's just a threat, if we told all companies that, listen, solve this problem, or we're going to make you solve it, they would find some oomph to get that done. But I would rather, in my ideal world, that wasn't the case. But we're not. We don't live in an ideal world, and imagining that this is a true meritocracy is not going to make it so.
So true. A question sort of following up to something you mentioned earlier, Vivian, but any of you guys could answer it. Are you seeing AI to date being capable of measuring resiliency? You alluded to that, but I wasn't sure if I heard, yes, it's happening, or towards it.
I'll keep this quick, and I'd love to hear from the others. We've done a lot of work in this space, not just resilience, but a number of different psychological constructs. Working memory span is highly predictive, and other things. A lot of metacognitive constructs. So normally these are defined either by little psychological tests or surveys. What we've done is say, okay, if we can get a bunch of people to take these tests, and then we go out and we find behavioral characteristics that are indicative of this. So in other words, instead of just throwing a bunch of data at a complex algorithm and hoping it figured out who the best performers are, if we said very concretely, we know something is causally related to success on the job. One of those things is resilience. Can we pick up signals so that we can find, for example, the guy that Paul was talking about, or back in the days of Guild, we always talked about Jade. Never went to university, never worked a job. Our algorithms said he was the second best developer in all of Los Angeles. And sure enough, within 2 years, he was off at founding his own company. But he was amazing. And one of the things we were able to do, and we've been able to extend since, is say, not definitively, like, again, don't let AI make this decision for you, but build a little AI, crawl through the relevant data set and say, surface those people who look resilient. Let me find all those diamonds in the rough, if you will, so I can stop looking at resumes and start looking at the things that are really predictive. If you use it as that kind of a tool to highlight things, to illuminate talent, then it's something. If don't hire someone just because this one single metric, it scores 100th of a point higher than someone else. but now you can surface a bunch of people. And what I guarantee you, because boy, we did this a lot, and I have since, is that is a wildly different looking population than the university degree or the past employer signal. You surface a couple of things, resilience, but I'll skip it. There's so many details, but you surface a couple of these features and you will find hundreds and hundreds of people that are exactly the population you want. But understand, again, this tool is just to highlight them. It's a discovery tool. It shouldn't be used to filter people out, just pull them to the surface. And one thing we're militant about is every time we train something like this out, we go and make certain it does not have a bias, that it doesn't surface people that are resilient, but never surfaces Pacific Islanders. You can't put that burden on any one group. So we only use models that we find are invariant to the kind of categories that they ought to be invariant to.
Thank you. Thank you, Vivian. Okay, we've reached the top of the hour. I want to respect the time of our panelists, our attendees. I want to thank, first of all, Filtered for having the courage to tee up this very challenging but meaningful conversation and necessary conversation. And I look forward to hopefully continuing the conversation. I want to encourage any attendee who this struck a nerve for or wants to hear more about it to reach out to us and let us know how we can possibly tee up another webinar or another way of answering some things that are on your mind. I definitely want to thank Kian, Paul, and Vivian so much for your time, your insights. I feel like this was like the appetizer, and there's so much more that we could go into. But again, really appreciate your time and attention on this one. Is there one thing that we didn't cover that any of you want to throw in before we sign off and thank our attendees? Any other sort of like words of hope or wisdom that we can leave people with before we sign off?
I would love to invite people, come visit socos.org. We have a number of pieces, the whole Joe versus Jose story, all of our analyses about representation, and more. You can find all that there and read more details about how we built these things and what we discovered.
Great. And I'll do this similar plug for what Workera is doing. Kian, you and your team, and also Paul, what you and the Filter team are doing, some really interesting work in the space of technical talent. So thank you guys very much again, and thank the audience for attending. You guys have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.